Have you ever really thought about a handshake? We're about to put that super common gesture under a microscope. And based on some really fascinating research, we're going to uncover this hidden world of communication that happens every single time we shake hands. So let's get into it.
So let's just ask it straight up. Is a handshake just, a polite way to say hello? Or is there something way more complex going on just beneath the surface? Turns out the answer is a lot more interesting than you might think. Okay, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the surprising science of the handshake itself. Then, we'll dive into the unconscious messages we're all sending. After that, we'll see how things change between men and women, connect that to a perspective from Islamic law, and wrap up by looking at how science and religion sometimes cross paths.
All right, first up, let's look past the social custom. What's actually happening on a biological level when our hands meet?
The source material makes it clear that a handshake is so much more than just a custom. It's a full-on biological event. The second our hands touch, it sets off these unconscious changes in our brain activity. Even our facial expressions start to shift in tiny ways we have absolutely no idea about. It's powerful and it's totally automatic.
And that biological reaction? That's just the start. Now we're going to get into something even cooler, this invisible world of messages being passed back and forth.
Okay, so check out this process. First, the handshake literally transfers chemical signatures or scents. Then, and this is wild, we make a totally involuntary move, bringing that hand closer to our face. Our nose picks up on these signals, and bam, our brain starts analyzing the data. The key thing here is that we never consciously decide to do any of this. It just happens.
This whole thing actually has a scientific name: chemosignaling. It's the subconscious transfer of information through chemicals. You can think of it like this primal form of communication that's always running in the background. And a handshake? It's one of the most direct ways we do it.
And get this, it gets even more sophisticated. The source points out that our brain doesn't just sniff the hand we shook, it actually compares that scent to our other hand, our non-shaking hand, to create a kind of baseline. This lets it zero in on and better understand the other person's unique chemical signature. How crazy is that?
So, we've got this incredible subconscious process all mapped out, but the source takes it one step further and asks a really important question, and that's where things get even more complex.
Right. What happens when this chemosignaling, this secret chemical conversation, happens between a man and a woman? Does the whole interaction change? Well, according to the research our source is looking at, the answer is a big, loud yes.
The source brings up a specific study with a pretty remarkable finding. If you look here, you can see that men who shook a woman's hand subconsciously spent way more time smelling that hand afterward, compared to when they shook another man's hand. This suggests the whole interaction triggers a much more intense subconscious analysis.
So why the huge difference? Well, the author of our source proposes a reason based on these findings. They suggest that women, throughout the day, unconsciously transfer subtle scents from their hair and body to their hands. When a handshake happens, those scents get passed to the man. The source argues that these particular scents can be stimulating. They get logged in the man's memory and might even create an unconscious pull for more connection.
It's this specific scientific argument, this idea about the stimulating nature of these scents, where the source makes its main connection. It builds a bridge from these findings to a specific ruling in Islamic law.
So the author puts forward this idea that the unconscious process of chemosignaling could give us a scientific reason for the Islamic prohibition on physical contact, like handshakes, between men and women who aren't closely related. The argument being made is that this rule acts as a kind of safeguard against that exact biological chain reaction we've been talking about.
And to really underline how seriously this rule is taken within the faith, the source cites a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. It really illustrates that avoiding this kind of contact is seen as incredibly important. Now, the author of the source doesn't just stop at touch. They take this exact same logic and apply it to another really powerful form of scent-based communication: perfume.
And here, the key word is pheromones. These are natural chemicals our bodies can secrete to attract the opposite sex. The source makes the point that these same chemicals are now often created in a lab and added to commercial perfumes, which makes them a really potent and intentional form of chemosignaling.
And once again, the author brings in a quote from Scripture to support this idea. This saying is used in the source to argue that Islamic law was already addressing the stimulating effects of scents.
viewing the intentional use of fragrance to attract male attention in a very, very serious light. Okay, for our final section, the source doesn't just wrap up the science. It ends with a commentary on how this sort of research is actually received in the world today.
So, in the last part of the text, the author kind of zooms out and shares a personal observation about how academic and cultural circles react when scientific research is guided by faith.
The author points back to that Handshake study, noting it was done by a Jewish researcher whose work was partly informed by the Torah's rules on touch. The author observes that this research got published in major journals and nobody called it backward. But in contrast, he feels that when Muslim researchers try to find scientific connections for Islamic rules, they often get a lot of heat, sometimes even from inside their own communities.
So, if we boil it all down, the central argument of our source is that modern science, in this case the study of chemosignaling, can give us a whole new lens to understand the potential reasons behind some of these ancient religious and social rules.
And that leaves us with a final, really interesting question to think about. Whether you see a direct link or not, the argument makes you ask, in our age of data and discovery, how might science change, challenge, or maybe even reaffirm how we look at ancient traditions? It's a fascinating place where things collide. Thanks for joining me.